wolf was standing in the kitchen doorway again, and Isolde Hartwell had stopped being surprised by it 3 mornings ago, which frightened her more than the wolf did. She set the bucket down slowly, the way she set down anything near something that could kill her without meaning to, and watched it watch her. It was enormous, even by the standards of the Alpha King's wolf, black going to iron-grey at the muzzle, and it had no business being in the lower kitchens at this hour, no business being anywhere near the servants' passage at all. The Alpha King kept his wolf where a king's wolf belonged, at his side in the great hall, at his heel in the training yard, folded at the foot of his bed at night, if the stories the upper staff traded were true. It did not wander. It did not choose its own doorways. Everyone said so, the way everyone said the sun rose in the east, as a fact too settled to examine. And yet here it was, for the 3rd morning running, sitting in her doorway, with its ears forward and its gold eyes fixed on her, with an attention that felt less like an animal's curiosity and more like a man's. Isolde had worked the lower kitchens of the capital keep for 6 years, ever since her mother's fever took her and the almoner's office decided a 14-year-old with no living kin was better fed as staff than pitied as a ward. She scrubbed the great cauldrons before dawn, and again before supper. She kept the dry stores ledger because she had a head for numbers and no one else wanted the job. She ate at the 2nd sitting, slept in the loft above the scullery with 4 other girls, and had long ago stopped expecting to be looked at by anyone above the rank of head cook. Invisibility was not a wound to her. It was a tool. She had built it carefully, the way she built anything useful, and she resented anything that threatened to take it apart. The wolf huffed, low in its chest, and lay down across her threshold as though it intended to stay. "You are in my doorway," she told it, because someone needed to say something, and the scullery girls were still asleep, and there was no one else to hear her talk to a king's wolf like it was a cat that had wandered in from the yard. "I have bread to proof." It did not move. She stepped around it carefully, giving it the respect its size demanded, but without the flinch she suspected it was watching for, and went to her ovens. When she looked back an hour later, it was gone, the way it had gone the 2 mornings before, without her ever seeing it leave. She did not mention it to anyone. There was no one to mention it to who would not either laugh at her or report her for saying strange things about the royal wolf, and Isolde had learned young that the safest position in any hierarchy was the one no one thought to examine. Her days ran the same shape they had run for 6 years, and she had come to find a certain comfort in the sameness of them. Before first light, she carried water from the well in the lower yard, 2 buckets at a time, the rope handles having long since worn a groove into the pads of her fingers that no longer troubled her. She built the ovens up from the banked coals left overnight, checked the dry stores against her ledger, and had the first bread-proofing before the rest of the keep had properly woken. It was hard work, and it asked nothing of her beyond competence, and competence was a thing Isolde had in steady, reliable supply. She did not resent the labour. She resented, when she allowed herself to resent anything, the particular manner in which the keep's upper residents had learned to look through her rather than at her, as though 6 years of scrubbing their cauldrons had rendered her a fixture of the room rather than a person passing through it. The kitchen girls she shared the scullery loft with were kind enough in the ordinary way of people who worked too hard to have much energy left for cruelty, and Isolde counted herself fortunate in that at least. She had grown up fast and alone, and she had built her invisibility the way a careful person builds a wall, not out of shame, but out of the plain understanding that being noticed by anyone above the 2nd sitting rarely went well for a girl with no house behind her name. The court above her, the true court, dealt in a different currency entirely. Lady Osyth Cravenmore moved through the great hall that same morning, in ermine the exact shade of new snow, accepting the bows of 2 lesser lords with the unhurried grace of a woman who had spent a decade making herself indispensable to a king who did not yet know he needed managing. She was not cruel in the way the old stories told it, no raised hand, no public scorn. Her danger was quieter than that. She sat on 3 councils. She had written half the procedural code the court now ran on. She had spent 11 years becoming the woman a king could not easily remove, and she intended to go on being that woman for the rest of her natural life, whatever it cost the people beneath her notice. The Alpha King himself was harder to see plainly, the way the sun was harder to look at directly. Renfred Ashcombe had held the throne since his father's death 4 years past, young for the weight of it, not yet 30, and it showed in nothing about him, not in his bearing, nor his build, nor the black hair he wore short and pushed back without ceremony. He was tall, in a way that made doorways look smaller when he passed through them, and heavily built through the shoulders and chest in the manner of a man who trained before dawn, because his body demanded it, rather than because his position required it. His eyes were a deep, near-black brown that gave away nothing to anyone who was not looking closely, and very few people looked at the Alpha King closely enough to notice that his wolf, this past week, had begun disappearing from his side for an hour at a time and returning without explanation, without a scent trail he recognized, without any account it seemed capable of giving him. That morning, in the council chamber, he asked his wolf a question with his mind, the way he had asked it 1,000 times before. The wolf gave him nothing back, but a kind of contentment he did not understand and could not place, the emotional equivalent of a door closing softly on a room he had not been invited into. It unsettled him more than he let show. A king's wolf did not keep secrets from him. It had never once, in his whole life, done a single thing he had not directed it to do. Word of the anomaly reached the corridors before Renfred fully understood what he was dealing with. A scullery girl, one of the upper cooks mentioned in passing while listing the week's small disasters, had been visited by the royal wolf 3 mornings running, in the lower kitchens, at an hour when the wolf ought to have been at the king's own bedside. The cook meant it as a curiosity, nothing more, the sort of odd small fact traded over kneading boards. But 2 of the older kitchen staff went quiet at the telling, and Isolde noticed, without being told why, that the story had already begun to travel further than she wanted it to. By the 2nd week, it was no longer possible to call it coincidence. The wolf came every morning now without variation, and had begun to follow her at a distance, never touching her, never blocking her path, but present in a way the whole lower keep had started to notice. Servants, who had never once acknowledged her existence, began finding reasons to walk past the kitchen doorway at that hour. The head cook, a broad, practical woman named Mabel Coombe, who had shown Isolde more kindness in 6 years than the rest of the keep combined, took to standing near the ovens on those mornings without saying why, the way a person stands near something they suspect might catch fire. It was Mabel who finally said the thing no one else would. "That is not an ordinary animal wandering," she said, low, while Isolde punched down the morning dough with more force than the task required. "That is his wolf, girl. His. It does not come down here on its own account. It has never come down here on its own account, not in all the years I've worked this kitchen, and I've worked it since before you were born." "I don't know why it comes," Isolde said, which was true, and did nothing to loosen the knot that had been sitting under her ribs since the first morning. "No," Mabel agreed, "but somebody upstairs is going to want to know why, and I would rather it not be you standing here alone when they come asking." The anomaly reached the great hall itself on the 9th morning, publicly, in a manner that put an end to any hope Isolde had of keeping it contained to the lower passages. She had been sent up with a tray, an ordinary errand, nothing that should have mattered, and the wolf, which had been lying at the foot of the dais where it belonged, rose the instant she crossed the threshold and crossed the entire length of the hall to stand beside her, in front of the assembled morning petitioners, in front of 2 visiting lords, in front of Lady Osythe Cravenmore, who did not so much as blink, but whose hand went very still around the stem of her cup. The hall went silent, in the particular way a room goes silent when everyone present understands they have witnessed something they cannot explain and are not permitted to ask about. Isolde did not run. She did not perform surprise, she did not entirely feel, 3 weeks into this. She set the tray down on the nearest table because her hands were shaking too much to trust with it, and she stood very still, the way she had learned to stand still years ago when the alternative was worse, and she waited for someone to tell her what happened next. What happened next was that the Alpha King looked at her, fully, directly, for the first time in 6 years of her existing 20 feet below his notice, and said nothing at all, because he did not yet have anything true to say. The court's categories had failed in front of witnesses, and there was no undoing that. Lady Cravenmore set her cup down with exact, unhurried precision, and Isolde understood without anyone explaining it to her that she had just become someone worth removing. Renfred did not sleep well that night, nor the next several. His wolf's contentment in her presence sat under his own skin like a splinter he could not locate, and he found himself 3 mornings later walking the east passage toward the lower kitchens, at an hour he had no official business being anywhere near them, telling himself it was a matter of court order and nothing more. He stood outside the kitchen doorway, out of sight, and watched. He told himself, standing there in the cold stone passage with the smell of proofing bread drifting out past him, that a king owed it to his household to understand any disruption to its ordinary function, and that this was all this was, an inspection, a matter of order, nothing that required examining too closely. He was not, by nature, a man who lied to himself often, and he found the exercise uncomfortable enough that he abandoned it within the first few minutes of watching her work. She was working, not performing for an audience, not aware she had one, simply working, the way she had clearly worked every morning of the 6 years. No one above the 2nd floor had bothered to learn her name. She corrected a tally mark on the dry store's ledger that the previous cook had entered wrong, crossed it through with a neat diagonal line, and did not sign the correction, because it was not the sort of thing a scullery girl signed her name to. Renfred found the ledger 3 days later, on the head steward's desk, where such things eventually surfaced, and read her correction 4 times before he understood what he was looking for. A precision that asked for nothing in return, that expected no one to ever notice it had been done correctly. He went to the archives that same afternoon. Cuthbert Ravensdale had kept the Capitol Keep's records for 40 years, and had long since stopped performing deference to anyone, including the king who paid his wage. He was the only person in the keep old enough and tired enough to say the thing plainly when Renfred asked him what it meant for a king's wolf to leave its post for a servant girl without command. "It means," Ravensdale said, not looking up from the scroll he was re-shelving, "that it hasn't happened since before your grandfather's time. 271 years, if the old accounts are kept straight, which they mostly are. The last time an Alpha King's wolf acted outside his will and toward a single unchosen person was the reign of Alaric III, and the woman it chose became his queen within the year, over the objection of every lord in this hall. The wolf does not do this for sport, my king. It has not had occasion to do it in nearly 3 centuries. I would think carefully before you decide it means nothing." Renfred did not answer, because he had no answer that did not require him to admit he had been thinking of very little else. He found Isolde 2 days later in the dry stores room, alone, counting sacks of grain against her ledger. And he did the thing he had not planned to do, which was crouch to the level of the low shelf she was working at, instead of standing over her the way rank required. "How long have you worked in this kitchen?" he asked. And it was not a command, and she understood, somewhere under the fear, that it was not a command. 6 years, she said, without performing the deference his rank was owed, because she had run out of the energy required to perform it convincingly. "I did not know that," he said. "Most people don't," she said, and there was nothing more to say after that. So he left, and came back the next morning at the same hour, for no reason he could have defended to anyone who asked. It became, without either of them naming it, a habit. He found reasons to be in the East Passage. She found herself listening for a particular unhurried step in the corridor, before she admitted to herself she was listening for it. Neither of them spoke of the wolf, which lay now most mornings across her threshold as though it had always belonged there, its gold eyes half closed, its tail still, a fact of her life that the rest of the keep had begun, uneasily, to accept as simply true. The first deliberate touch happened on an ordinary Tuesday in the same East Passage, when he was leaving and she was arriving, and their paths crossed at the narrow turn by the linen store. He had been about to pass her without a word, the way rank permitted and habit half suggested, and instead he stopped and straightened the collar of her cloak where it had folded under itself at the shoulder. 1 motion, 2 seconds, his knuckles brushing the side of her throat without any weight behind it at all, and continued down the corridor without looking back. Isolde stood still for a long moment before she remembered where she had been going. She told herself it meant nothing. She thought about it for the rest of the day anyway. Lady Cravenmore, who missed very little that happened within these walls, began to move. It started as procedure, the way everything Osythe Cravenmore did started as procedure. A petition, filed properly, questioning whether a servant of unknown lineage ought to be granted continued access to the upper passages given the disruption her presence was causing to the smooth function of the household. A second petition, quieter, raising the question of whether the girl's presence near the king constituted a security concern that the council was obligated to investigate. Neither petition named cruelty, neither raised a hand against her. They simply built, brick by procedural brick, a case for Isolde Hartwell's removal that used the court's own rules so precisely that no one could call it anything but reasonable. Isolde felt the walls of her ordinary life narrowing around her, and understood, for the first time in 6 years, that invisibility was no longer available to her as a shelter. She could be seen, or she could be removed. There was no third option left. Lady Cravenmore never once raised her voice in the discussions that followed, and that, more than anything, was what told Isolde how dangerous the woman truly was. She addressed the council in the same even, cultivated tone she used for every other matter of household procedure, as though the removal of a kitchen girl were no different in weight from the reallocation of a grain store. She did not name Isolde directly where she could help it. She spoke instead of irregularities in household access and unresolved questions of lineage that the Crown is obligated to investigate before further proximity is permitted. Phrases built to sound reasonable to men who had never once had to justify their own place in a room. Isolde, listening from the edge of the second petition's reading, understood that she was watching a woman use the very rules that had kept people like Isolde invisible for generations, turn now with precision against the one moment those rules had failed to hold. It was in the crush of a market-day crowd in the lower yard, 3 days after the second petition was filed, that the antagonist's pressure became briefly, dangerously physical, not through Lady Cravenmore's own hand, but through the crowd itself, which surged without warning when a cart overturned near the gate, and Isolde was nearly taken off her feet, in the crush of bodies, before an arm came around her, solid and certain, and pulled her back against a chest that did not move an inch under the weight of the crowd pressing past. Renfred did not look down at her. She did not look up at him. When the press of people cleared, he released her without a word, and she told herself unconvincingly that her pulse was only the crowd's doing. She saw him, 3 nights later, through the half-open door of the council chamber, long after the lords had gone. He was alone, sitting with a single candle burned low, holding a page of the second petition that he had clearly been reading for some time. He had not turned it once in the better part of an hour. She stood in the corridor and watched a man who managed every visible thing in this keep, also managing, in private, the cost of managing all of it. And something in her understanding of him shifted, not attraction exactly, or not only that, but recognition, the specific and unbearable knowledge that the person everyone deferred to had no one left to defer to in turn. She did not go in. She carried it with her instead, down the corridor and into the following days, a private and unresolved wait. There was a night, not long after, when they nearly said the thing neither of them had yet found words for. He had found her in the dry store's room again, later than either of them should reasonably have been awake, and he had been about to say something. She could see it gathering in him, the particular stillness that came before he committed to a sentence, and she had been about to let him, had leaned very slightly toward whatever he was preparing to hand her, when his second knocked at the outer door and entered without waiting for an answer, some matter of the northern road repairs that could not wait for morning. By the time the door closed again, neither of them could quite find their way back to the sentence that had been building between them, and it sat unfinished in the space between them for days afterward, more present for having gone unsaid than it would have been spoken aloud. It was after that same night, once the second's business had finally been resolved and the corridor outside had gone quiet, that he found her still standing where he had left her, and instead of speaking, he simply put his forehead against hers, one hand resting light at the side of her jaw, and exhaled slowly, like a man setting something heavy down after carrying it a long way. She did not move. She did not speak. She put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat steady itself under her palm, and for a long moment that was enough, the two of them standing in the low light, with nothing resolved and nothing needing to be, until the household's ordinary business called them both back to their separate corners of the keep. The dry store's room held one more thing Isolde had never spoken of to anyone, and Ravensdale's mention of Alaric III's reign had put it back in her mind with a force she could not shake. Her mother had died with a small tin box under her mattress, dented and old, its lid soldered shut along one seam by someone long before Isolde had been born. Her mother had never explained it, and had made her promise, in the last fever-thinned week of her life, never to force it open, never to let anyone else see it, and to keep it close, no matter what became of her. Isolde had kept that promise for 6 years out of grief, more than curiosity. It sat now at the bottom of her single trunk in the scullery loft, wrapped in a spare shift, and she had told herself for 6 years that it held nothing more than a dead woman's small vanities. She took it to Ravensdale on the evening after she watched Renfred through the council chamber door, because she had run out of other places to carry her fear, and because some instinct she did not fully trust told her the old archivist would not laugh at her for asking. He turned the box over twice in his hands, ran a thumbnail along the solid seam, and went very still in a way that made Isolde's stomach drop before he said a single word. "Your mother," he said slowly, "was not simply a cook, if this is what I believe it is. This seal was cut with the mark of the old bloodline register, the one kept before the last reorganization, back when the crown still tracked which houses carried the recessive blood that answers to a king's wolf without needing a formal claim. I would need proper light and an hour. I do not currently have to be certain. But if I am right, girl, this box is not sentiment. It is proof of exactly the kind of lineage the council has spent 2 petitions pretending you cannot possibly have." Isolde carried the box back to the loft that night, and did not open it, because it was not yet time, and because some part of her understood already that the moment she finally did would be the moment nothing in her life could go back to being small and overlooked again. The council convened 11 days later to rule on the second petition, in the great hall, before the full assembly of lords Lady Cravenmore had spent a decade cultivating. Frost had settled thick on the windows of the great hall that morning, and the fires along the walls had been built up higher than usual against it, the smell of wood smoke thick enough to catch in the back of the throat. Isolde walked in through the same doors she had carried trays through for 6 years, and this time she carried the tin box instead, its lid finally pried open by Ravensdale's careful hand 2 nights before, its contents, a folded bloodline record, bearing her mother's true house name, sealed with the mark of a line the Crown's own registers listed as extinguished, not extinct, resting now in a leather folder under her arm. She did not wait to be given permission to speak. She set the folder on the long table before the council, opened it, and laid the record flat where every lord present could see the seal for himself. My mother was born Ilse Draycott, of the line the Crown's own records call extinguished rather than ended, she said, and her voice did not shake the way she had expected it to. The distinction matters, my lords, because extinguished means removed by decree, not by death. I did not know this 3 weeks ago. I know it now. I would ask the council to explain why a bloodline capable of answering a king's wolf without formal claim was struck from the register 40 years before I was born, and who benefited from striking it. The silence that followed was not the silence of a hall that did not understand what it was witnessing. It was the silence of a hall that understood exactly and was waiting to see who would be made to answer for it. Lady Cravenmore's composure held for 3 full seconds longer than anyone else's would have, which was itself the tell Ravensdale had told Isolde to watch for. Her family, it emerged within the hour, under the council's own procedural questioning, had petitioned for the Draycott line's removal from the register 4 decades past, on the private and unrecorded grounds that a rival claim to influence over the Crown's wolf-bound bloodlines was inconvenient to certain ambitions being quietly built at the time. Osyth Cravenmore had inherited the benefit of that old decree without ever having to dirty her own hands with its execution, and had spent 11 years since building a position on ground she had known the entire time did not fully belong to her. The council did not order a dramatic punishment. They struck the old decree from the register, restored the Draycott name to its rightful line, and referred Lady Cravenmore's family holdings to a formal inquiry that would, over the following months, dismantle piece by procedural piece the influence she had spent a decade constructing. Her eyes, when the ruling was read, showed something Isolde had never once seen in them before. Not defiance, fear. Renfred watched Isolde stand before the full council and dismantle, with nothing but a paper record and a level voice, the case built against her, and understood in that moment that what his wolf had recognized in her 3 weeks ago was only the smallest part of what there was to recognize. When the hall began to empty, he crossed to where she stood and asked her quietly, not as a command, whether she would stay. "Not because the wolf chose you," he said. "Whatever it means, whatever your bloodline proves, that is not why I am asking. I am asking because I would like you to stay." Isolde looked at him for a long moment, the way she had learned to look at anything that might cost her something if she answered it wrong, and found, for the first time in 6 years, that she did not want to protect herself from this particular cost. "I would like that too," she said. 2 months passed before either of them spoke of it plainly again, because the keep did not rearrange itself in a single afternoon, simply because a decree had been struck from a register. There were still lords who did not know what to do with a woman who had grown up scrubbing their kitchen's cauldrons, now dining at the second table by choice rather than assignment, still council members who addressed her with a careful formality that had not yet decided what shape it wanted to take. Isolde did not mind this as much as she had expected to. She kept the dry stores ledger still, though no one required it of her any longer, because the habit of the work had become part of who she was, rather than a mark of what she had been forced to be, and no one who knew her thought this was strange. Mabel Coombs still ran the lower kitchens with the same brisk, unceremonious authority she always had, and had taken to sending up a girl each morning with fresh bread for Isolde's rooms, a small, ordinary courtesy that meant more to Isolde than any of the formal deference the council had begun, haltingly, to extend her. Ravensdale, for his part, had grown fond of stopping by in the evenings, with some fragment of the old bloodline records he thought she would want to see, the Draycott name and its history laid out slowly, patiently, over weeks, until the shape of her mother's people became something Isolde understood, rather than simply carried. The tin box sat open now on the window-sill of the small set of rooms she had been given in the east wing, empty of its old record, holding instead whatever cut flowers Mabel Combe brought up from the kitchen garden on the mornings she still came to visit, which was most mornings. The wolf slept across Isolde's threshold every night now, without being sent there, and without anyone remarking on it any longer, the way a fact becomes ordinary once it has had long enough to settle. It was not remarkable that a king's wolf loved her. It simply was, the way the sun rose, and no one in the keep found any further reason to discuss it. Renfred had learned, in those 2 months, a particular way of being with her that had not existed anywhere in his life before her. He told her things, matter-of-factly, the way a man delivers a report rather than a confession, his difficult history with the oldest council lord, his private opinion on the state of the northern road repairs, small facts that cost him something to hand over, and asked nothing of her in return. She had come to understand that this was his version of intimacy, and she had stopped waiting for him to offer the grander kind, because she had learned that grand was not where the truth of him lived. On a cold morning in early winter, with the wolf asleep across the doorway, and Mabel's flowers open in the tin box on the sill, Isolde asked him, without preamble, why he had changed her kitchen shift all those months ago, back before either of them had said anything honest to the other, so that she no longer walked back to the scullery loft after dark. "I did not like the idea of you walking back alone," he said. "That was 6 months ago," she said, "before any of this." "I am aware of that," he said, and did not explain further, because there was nothing further that needed explaining, and she understood, the way she had come to understand most of what he did not say aloud, exactly what it had meant even then. He put his hand against the side of her face, tilting her chin up the way he had never once done in the 6 years she had existed below his notice, and she leaned into the weight of his palm without deciding to. Neither of them spoke. The wolf did not lift its head from the threshold. Outside, the ordinary business of the keep went on the way it always had. Cauldrons scrubbed, ledgers kept, a fire built up against the cold, and none of it required either of them to explain what they had become to each other. He kissed her once, carefully, the way a man kisses someone he has spent a long time learning how to be careful with, and the kitchen fire went on burning behind them, and the wolf slept on across the threshold it had chosen for itself 271 years after the last time it had chosen anything at all. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, for the first time in either of their lives, everything.